the really unfortunate thing that I like hate about you and I, Tom, is that if I shaved my head, we would be like fucking clones. That is the most womanly shit I've ever heard in my entire life. You should smoke a cigarette like a real man, Tom. I'm the man here. And then I'm going to pull up the screenshot for you guys while I'm waiting for confirmation that he wants me to join his Discord or not. So this is what I'm asking him about. This is what I was curious about. So he's talking about, you don't know enough to talk about this with anyone unless you're learning. You confuse your own community more and rile them up. I know you care about individual trans people's feelings more than the community or the trans community, but it's irresponsible for you to keep talking about things when you know absolutely nothing about them. And then smearing people who actually know. Oh, and because calling yourself non-binary doesn't mean you're actually non-binary, especially if you don't know what the word means. That's why you would want to talk to somebody like me. People are co-opting the trans movement to take away. So this is what we're talking about. So I had a question. What I had asked him was, I messaged this to him and I said, do you still believe like this take? And I said, so I'm actually going to get my notes up here. So these were my questions. He said specifically that he does not want to talk about the linguist stuff, and that's whatever. I don't have to talk to him about that. He's already kind of, ran himself into the dirt with that one. That's fine. So these are the two. That's what I wanted to talk to him about. I'm going to show, while we're waiting, I'm going to show you guys some memes, because I have some banger Tom memes for you, okay? Remember how I told you that he had the thing where he accidentally showed the pictures on stream, and it was, like, of his GF, and then he was like, it's actually, like, a masculine trans person, and, like, the esternized breasts, you know what I'm talking about? So I made this for you guys. Well, I actually made it for me, so... this is what he said about it. He said, yeah, it's a masculine trans person who has maybe taken estrogen or something. They're just jacking off and making like a really gross face. It was just meant to be shocking. I was like in tears making this. I thought it was so funny. Okay. And then this is my other one. So this is his diagram. And then this is so the text on this is, yeah, it's a masculine trans person who has maybe taken estrogen or something. They're just jacking off and making a really gross face, and it was just meant to be shocking. And then this is the goon zone. I was cracking up, you guys, cracking up. I was LOLing so hard. So hard was I LOLing.
Muted. Hey, yo.
What is good, my dude?
Oh, crap. I got you on the wrong. Okay, say something again.
Yellow.
There we go. Much better. Dude, I'm always, every time, because of what you tell me in DMs, I'm always surprised at how young you sound.
That's because I'm a T-slur. That's what that's for. That's why that happens.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Okay, I didn't know that. So, but you do go by he, him, yes?
Yeah, I'm a trans guy. I just still have remnants of my lady voice.
I never would have been able to tell. You have a very good voice.
Thank you, Tom. That means the world to me. Did you want me to cam up, or are you good? Just chilling with this.
Yeah, if you want to cam up, I that would be better.
Sure thing. Let me just do that. Okay. Beautiful.
Damn, yeah, dude. You went all out. You did fucking well. Do you mind if I did you transition early?
I started transitioning when I was 20? 19, 20?
20?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. It's been a minute. Sorry, I'm just fighting for my life right now, watching, trying to organize, like, my 97 tabs that I have open. I deeply apologize.
No, you're fine. I'm setting up the stream right now and getting the cams all set up and everything, so you can take your time.
Okay, sick.
Yeah, I'm probably going to be on for, like, hours longer, so I know you said that you have a time limit, so however long you want to go is fine with me, because, yeah, I have no limit on this, so.
No, you're good. I'm just on, I'm on the West Coast, but I get off pretty early because I work early, and then my wife gets off of work early as well. So she's always like, what are you doing? Can you, like, watch a TV show with me or something?
Okay, I got you. Oh, let me give you my cam as well, so you can actually see who you're talking to. Okay. Do you stream?
I do.
You do? Are you streaming now?
I sure am, bud. It's Goddamnit Malcolm on YouTube and FT Mongoose on Twitch.
Okay, cool. All right. So are you ready? Do you want to
Yeah,
get into it, or?
I am all good. I know that you
All
said
right.
that you didn't want to talk about like any of the drama and shit, and that's fine. That would be a separate conversation regardless. So no worries at all.
Okay. Um. Yeah, like again, like as far as like drama goes, like I don't want to talk about like personal stuff, but as far as like the ideas go, like if you want to get into anything about like authorities or expertise or any of these things, I'm happy to have those conversations.
Sure. Okay. I will say quickly before we get started though, the really unfortunate thing that I like hate about you and I, Tom, is that if I shaved my head, we would be like fucking clones. It'd be like we were looking in the mirror at each other, and I really don't like that.
It's
But
very true. I will keep the glasses off for this conversation.
thank you for sparing me. Okay. All right.
Unless I got to go like read something, but
Okay. All right. So I saw the little this is the only one that I've read. I assume that they're all kind of regurgitating the same thing. It was the one that I sent you in DMs. I have that up on my stream right now. It was the one that you had sent to Akio about the neopronoun or not Ico. Sorry, I always say Akio. Ico, about the like xenogender, like neopronoun, like non-binary shit. And I had sent the questions that I wanted to ask you in DMs as well. So, and you obviously said like, oh, well, let's just talk about it because it's easier than typing everything out. So, the first question that I had, and people on my stream can read it. I'm not gonna read it out to them. They're old enough to read. My first question was like, so you say in the message like, people shouldn't call themselves non-binary because like you can't just say that you're non-binary and then become non-binary, and you shouldn't use that word if you don't know what it means. So like when you say that, one, what do you think non-binary means, and then two, how do you denote who is non-binary and who is not, unless you're going purely off of perfect androgyny?
I kind of am, yes. So not perfect androgyny, but I would say something relatively close to androgyny. So I think the last time we talked about this, we were talking about like gender being on a spectrum and the fact that like people are relating somewhere on that spectrum, that like their identity is relating to something somewhere on that spectrum when it comes to masculinity and femininity. And I would say that somebody who is non-binary, meaning they're not able to pick one or the other within the binary, they're going to be pretty much in the middle, and that there really aren't other options outside of that, that there really is just like a two-pole spectrum, and then just kind of the blurry middle part where it's not really clear between one or the other.
Sure. So I would say that. So are you familiar at all? So I'll preface by saying that every non-binary person that I know is binary presenting in some fashion or another, like outside of like garb. So if you medically transition, if you're going one way or the other, your desired result is kind of irrelevant. So I know people that microdose testosterone. Eventually, after you're on it long enough, you're going to masculinize, period. Same thing with estrogen after a certain amount of time. So anything outside of like dyeing your hair, having like a septum piercing, or wearing, like crop tops when you have a beard, like if you're talking strictly about like external presentation, not secondary sex characteristics, I could see that. But under the concept of non-binary, like if you're looking at it through the lens of somebody who is looking at the spectrum and they say masculine and feminine, what were you going to say? I'm sorry.
I would say both. If we're talking about gendered characteristics, I would definitely include secondary sex characteristics as part of your gendered like that's why people take the hormones, is to have the secondary sex characteristics that are going to align with the gender.
Well, outside of nullification, there's not another way to do that because there's not like a middle ground with medical transition. If you get into like really esoteric shit like nullification or microdosing and things like this, or they call it like hormone flipping, where you go back and forth on either or of them, and these are like very niche. These are very, very rare. Everybody who is non-binary will transition in a binary fashion. So the idea that they're essentially like being defined as non-binary by perfect androgyny, when the whole point of like non-binary is not to exist in the middle of the poles, it's to remove yourself from the spectrum entirely, where you don't adhere to the spectrum, right?
Right.
Okay, so
yeah, so just okay. There's a couple of different conversations there, and this is like
okay.
part of the issue in that conversation that you're referring to, is that in that one, the problem that everybody had is that he was just purely talking about what people use as their identity. And and I was asked to go talk to her about what the concepts are in and of themselves and what it is that we're actually communicating when we say the words. And so the if we're specifically talking about what it is that I'm getting into there, it is just like a linguistic aspect of what is it that we're communicating with these words, and then does the identity actually latch on to that communication.
Yeah, so I would argue that like if we're looking at it from a linguistic perspective of like the connotation that we draw in our minds when we think of non-binary, and this was one of the criticisms that I had about your gender document as a whole. The last time that we only spoke, I think, for like maybe 15 minutes. It was late for me as well. The concept of like the idea, like, and I mean this with the utmost respect, okay? This is like a 101 understanding of this, where it's like you have masculine and you have feminine, and and everything in between is non-binary. But most people that will identify with non-binary are trying to separate themselves from the binary, not to fit in that dialectic, like right in the middle, where they're androgynous, or they're not exactly masculine, they're not exactly feminine. They want to remove themselves from that spectrum entirely and exist outside of the confines of the binary. That's why you can have people who are non-binary who present in a either masculine or entirely feminine way, like most non-binary people do, because they remove the gendered aspect from their perspective on that identity. So if I'm a non-binary trans guy, I'm not, but if I was, and I know many non-binary trans guys who present exactly the way that I do, they remove the idea that presenting this way or looking this way for me is masculine, where they're trying to essentially do abolition in the concept of gender, and they do that internally. So if I'm looking at it from an outside perspective, I can understand what you're saying, where it's like when I'm looking at somebody and I'm determining their gender, which is what our brains do automatically, seeing that perfect androgyny, you would be like, oh, I bet that person's non-binary. And you can signify that with things like dyed hair or, like androgynous dress and things like that. But the reality is that non-binary people, one, medically transition in a binary fashion, period, unless they're doing nullification. And two, their goal isn't to sit in the center. Their goal is to remove themselves from it.
Okay. So again, I feel like this is why we like came to like a consensus last time, and I could be wrong, so I could be mixing you up with somebody else. But I feel like last time when we got into this, I had to like keep like repeating that it states very clearly at the beginning, this is a descriptive claim on language, and that this is not prescriptive. This is not like political. This is not saying what gender ought to be. This is not saying how we ought to communicate it. It's not saying how we ought to engage with trans people or cis people or anything like that. It is just describing the words that we use and trying to say how we use them. So before we get into that, I do want to repeat again. I am not saying perfect androgyny. I am saying that there is at least a there's at least a question there where it's enough for them to be considered non-binary. I would say that the blurry middle is fairly larger than most people would think, and especially for people who do take hormones but are not trying to pass as a specific gender. So when you keep saying like, oh, they're doing, they are going to end up transitioning on a binary spectrum, it is not that simple to where people are all that passing, and lots of people either and end up using non-binary as a transitionary phase, or it is they are non-binary because they don't really identify with one or the other. That's how I came to that conclusion, was talking to a ton of non-binary people and asking them, what does it mean to be non-binary? And all of them would give these very different esoteric explanations that were kind of out there and kind of weird. And each and every one of them, I asked them after they gave their explanation, I said, so would you say you just don't identify with masculinity nor femininity, and that you're just kind of somewhere in the middle? And 100% of them said yes. And so that's how I ended up like getting to that conclusion.
Yeah, and so like I would disagree on the idea that that is an accurate description of like how people either like like psychologically, medically, or even like interpersonally would identify or describe themselves as being non-binary is most, if not all non-binary people describe themselves as being like a third or other gender, not in the middle of or a mix of the two. Even when you look at diagnostic criteria, even when you look, what'd you say?
I just don't believe in that. Like when you say like identifying off the spectrum, I believe once you're talking about something that is off the spectrum, you stop. You are no longer talking about gender, and now you're talking about something else. If it's a different spectrum, it's just something different then.
I mean, not necessarily in the sense that if we're linguistically, when we're communicating like with gender, the way that that would be described is somebody who does not adhere to that spectrum. In the same way that I could say, you know, like I could say to you right now, like I'm African American, and you'd be like, Malcolm, you're high as fuck, like put down the crack pipe. You can separate off of the spectrum. And linguistically, there is still room to describe that phenomenon of somebody who does not identify with that spectrum.
You are making a prescription at
No,
that point.
that's not a prescription. That's like how it's defined. And that's the way that people would define it, like medically. That's the way that people would define it psychologically. And that's the way that people would self-identify more often than not as like a third other thing instead of in the middle.
When you say medically, you mean with gender affirming care. That is prescriptive. That like it is not, because when we're talking about gender, we are talking about masculinity and femininity.
Well, and that has to exist within the context of medicalization, though. That has to exist within that context. So within these specific contexts, like the language means nothing if we can't apply it. So if I'm applying it to either a medical standard, a psychological standard, a counseling standard, or a linguistic way that non-binary people communicate to me, the way that they identify, within all of these different contexts, it is uniformly described as like another thing, not diametrically opposed to either masculinity or femininity.
Okay. I understand that. But this is my, and I don't know if I did a good job of explaining this. And after I wrote it, I had planned on rewriting the whole thing. It was meant to be like, the doc was meant to be like, that was just the rough draft. I did 100% of that on stream and like over the course of like a year to 2 years, somewhere in there, and like going through research and putting things in there, or I would just finish a debate and be like, okay, I need to add this in and make sure that that's talked about. And, that I don't know if I did a good job of explaining this, but what I am saying in there is that if there is a thing called non-binary, it is androgyny. But that the idea and concept of non-binary that is considered gendered, I do not believe in this, and I think that it's just like a fairy tale.
I mean, that would just be contradictory to like any kind of linguistic perspective on it, because you're going to like take into consideration the context and how the word's applied, and you're going to take into consideration like the way that it's descriptively used by people who like use that identity. It just wouldn't make sense to not adhere to this idea that it's like off of the spectrum.
Yes, but again, the identity is in there. I talk about the fact that like identity is saying that like you are identifying with something. There is some sort of category that you see and you relate to that. Like,
but you can also have identification void of a category. I could say that I am not a fan of the Mariners. I'm excluding myself from that category. In the same way that I could say I am non-binary, I am off of that spectrum. I'm excluding myself from that category. That also counts as an identifier.
You can. But when you say I'm not a fan of the Mariners, and I say, oh, okay, so is there another baseball team that you like? And you say, I'm not talking about baseball. Well, now I just don't care that you're not a Mariners fan, because I don't know what the fuck you mean anymore.
Well, yeah, so I can exclude myself from a category with like a statement about like, I am not a fan of the Mariners. You say, okay, well, what are you a fan of? And I say, I'm not a fan of baseball. I'm a fan of basketball. I'm excluding myself linguistically from that category by articulating that I am separating myself from that category. Identifying outside of it within it of itself is an identification. So if I say, you know, I'm non-binary, I'm not saying, you know, like I identify under the binary. Within the, like the literal word means to identify outside of, to identify not with. And so like there is that descriptive aspect of it where when you're thinking about it in your head, if you think, okay, this person does not identify with this category, it's hard for me to like visually see somebody who I would filter into this category, but that's not what the word means. What it means is to be separate from.
Understand again, like I get but we are talking about it
Hilarious.
as
You can't
an
stand the
identity.
truth.
And now I am saying, okay, well, what is it that you are actually identifying with? If somebody looks like Hulk Hogan but says I identify as a woman, that identity, like I do believe, and this is something that I've gotten into fights with people about, because they take it as this more like spiritual thing that again don't believe in. When I talk about identities, I'm talking about something that you are using to categorize yourself because you relate with something else. You are now putting yourself in that category and saying, this is what I relate to. But if instead now you're Hulk Hogan saying, I identify as a woman, and there is no sign there whatsoever that gives me any indication that you have anything to do with the gender woman, it loses 100% of its utility in the communication of the word woman. That word is now useless in that context, outside of the fact that you are just telling me you feel that way, and that's fine, but it doesn't mean anything outside of that.
So like, I think what the disconnect is that we're kind of missing the idea between like perceived identity from true identity. Do you believe in the concept of like, if I told you that Logic is mixed race, let's say I say, hey, Logic is white. You say, no, he's not. He's mixed. And I say, no, he's white. He looks white to me. Is there a truth of the matter to that claim that Logic is white or black or mixed?
No, but there is there if he said that, if you said he was Mexican or Latino instead, there would be a like something closer to some sort of objectivity there that is losing its utility at that point.
Well, then what's the point of any category ever? Because even in your document, you use the analogy of like the chair. I could literally like shit on the floor and say that's a chair. Why even have the category of chair then? If the lines are so fuzzy, because you have to be appealing to some underlying fact.
I'm not saying no, that is my point. My point is that we are pointing to some sort of underlying fact that is agreed upon collectively. And so when we say that something is a chair, even though we can't put rigid definitions on what that thing is, we all collectively agree on it anyways, because we have a concept in our heads that we believe in.
You use the word like objectively, like speaking about like a fact of the matter about somebody's identity. If somebody is black, but they're albino, and you look at them and you think that person is white, imagining that this person doesn't have like, facial characteristics that you would assume to be like that of somebody who is African American. If you look at that person and you say, you're white, and they say, no, I'm not, I'm black. And you say, no, you're white. Somebody there is right and somebody there is wrong. Do you believe that there is that underlying fact about identity?
What I said was something closer to objectivity. I don't believe there is an objective fact of the matter. No, I don't believe that. But I do believe that there is some utility within the concepts that we believe in, and that even though there are blurry lines do not defeat the entire concept in and of itself. Chairs still exist.
Sure, but that devolves into absurdity. That like defeats the purpose of linguistics, because if I say this person is black, even if they don't look black, that defeats the purpose of like the utility of the word. In the same way, if I shit on the floor and I say that's a chair, you say, no, Malcolm, that's not a chair. That's obviously a pile of shit. That defeats the purpose of the utility of the word if we're not appealing to something that's true. Because otherwise, we could literally argue back and forth and neither of us would be right.
That is my argument. I don't know why I'm so lost now, because you are making my argument is that yes, if Hulk Hogan says he's a woman, it defeats the purpose of the utility of the word. We have lost the utility in that word now, because it's not actually relaying the information that we are using the word to relay.
And the word to relay is somebody who identifies off of that spectrum. That's all that means. In the same way that like I could say I'm trans and you could say, no, you're not, Malcolm, you're full of shit. There's still an underlying truth to that matter regardless of how I look, right? There's still a fact underneath that.
Again, and I'm saying you can identify with whatever you want, but whether or not, I am not denying that people can identify with things, right? So I've said over and over, if somebody tells me, hey, I identify as cuttlefish gender, I will respect that gender in like some sort of pragmatic engagement with this person out of respect. But Does that mean that I actually believe that that cuttlefish has anything to do with gender whatsoever? No, not at
Well,
all.
that is the point, is that they're using those words to remove themselves from the spectrum, right? And if you're leaning, so if I agree with you that there is like a fact of the matter underneath. So like if you say, you know, if we say that Hulk Hogan is a woman, things devolve into absurdity or whatever. In that instance, how do you argue for the existence or like the validation of trans people who haven't medically transitioned at all?
Again, pragmatic engagement. Like, it isn't that they actually fit the concept, but it is that, like, we would just, out of respect, pragmatically respect that this is something, because, like, especially when it comes to gender dysphoria, right? And I think this is something that I said to you in DMs as well, is that when it comes to gender dysphoria, somebody having like a different pronoun or something like that, of course, like I want to make sure that I respect that, because there is an entire mental illness attached to this that has like consequences to it. But my brother, I call him a little girl all the time, and I call him a woman all the time, and I call him a bitch all the time. His name's Mitchell. I call him Michelle. Like, I do this fucking with him all the time, and he fucks with me. This is funny. We do this no problem. But if he had gender dysphoria, I would not do that at all, ever, because it is totally different then and has consequences to it. So when I do this in respect for somebody who has gender dysphoria, I am doing this because of the gender dysphoria. If you don't have gender dysphoria, I'm not doing it anymore.
Well, so non-binary people can also be dysphoric, but my question more so is like,
Correct.
just purely out of like the aspect of respect, you would still, so if we're referring to like objective or like any kind of objective truth underneath the matter of like a word invoking like a concept or a thought, for what reason then would you just say that you like hated me and you weren't a respectful person? What, out of respect outside of that, would you ever consider me to be a man?
Who is
if that's what you're appealing
Calvin
to?
Garrar?
Well, you fit the concept of a man. So I would just call you a man regardless. I don't have to know that you have gender dysphoria one way or the other. You just fit the concept of a man. But Hulk Hogan does not fit the concept of a woman. And so if he says, hey, I'm a woman, but doesn't have gender dysphoria, I'm not calling him a woman, and I'm not calling him she, her. I'm calling him a man, and I'm calling him he, him.
So if Hulk Hogan had gender dysphoria, you would call Hulk Hogan a woman?
Yes. And especially like assuming that, because if they have gender
well, then why would you
dysphoria,
ever appeal to like the linguistic properties and like the absurdity then? Because Hulk Hogan doesn't fit the like what would be considered or perceived as a woman. It's just a respect thing. Then why even honor language at all?
Because again, what I'm describing in there is a descriptive reality of gender, but that descriptive realities do not align with how we interact with people each and every day. That is not the full picture. There are prescriptions in there that are, and that's why I explain very clearly that I am not telling anybody that they should deny trans people's identities or their preferred pronouns or anything like this, and I try to make it clear that I do not advocate for that in any way, even though I am telling you that they do not fit the concept if they don't have any process, or yes, if they haven't started any process of transitioning, they likely just don't fit the concept whatsoever.
Well, we have like two contradictory things that are at odds. Is like we want to honor we want to be respectful and kind to other people if they may be suffering, but we will do that at the expense of linguistic utility. But linguistic utility is kind of the paramount of what we're trying to reach. So square that circle for me. Like if we don't want anything to devolve into absurdity, and we want to make sure that we're being consistent in our application so we can understand each other when we communicate concepts, why would I override that principle in order to like basically hug box somebody about their feelings?
Because there are other things that are more important than that sometimes. I think that people's health can be more
Why can't
important.
you apply that to non-binary people then and understand that just because they don't look androgynous, okay, so you can okay, so you can see that
gender dysphoria.
Yeah, and they can be dysphoric and want to exist off that spectrum, right? So do you see where I'm coming from?
I don't know that. I don't know about that.
I'm happy to send this to you. That's the way that it's like dictated in everything.
I haven't seen like real evidence that gender dysphoria ever actually like pushes an identity that is off the spectrum.
What do you think about people that get nullification? Do you think that that's not a form of dysphoria?
When you say nullification, you're talking about just trying to get rid of gendered characteristics?
Yeah, nullification is like the complete removal of any kind of sex characteristics.
Sex characteristics are going to be different than gendered characteristics, though.
So, like somebody who looks like you, without a mustache, without a goatee, they don't have a dick, they don't have nipples. All they have is a pee hole and a butthole. Complete nullification. That is pure androgyny. Do you think that somebody can be dysphoric in that way?
Yeah, sure, but again, gender is a lot more than just that. You're just naming secondary sex characteristics.
Well, because that's what you associated with dysphoria is going to be the sex characteristics, and you also mentioned sex characteristics as a way that we're going to categorize people for linguistic utility. So I'm tying it together to say that, like, one, there is dysphoria for that. Go ahead.
I don't think I did. I think that gender dysphoria aligns with a lot more things than just like primary and secondary sex characteristics.
You're right. That's true. But if I am basically a gendered blob, I am the perfect epitome of androgyny, like physically and socially. I'm going to be addressed that way in public as well. That would satiate social dysphoria. That would satiate my physical dysphoria. Like, does that make sense? What I'm asking is that, like, does it not make sense that the dysphoria is able to be separated from this binary system, where it's not like I'm dysphoric about looking too masculine, I'm dysphoric about looking too feminine, I want to balance right in the middle, when pragmatically, unless you have somebody who, like, steps off and does this complete nullification, you don't think that that can exist. You still can't have somebody that wants to be off without that.
From the definition, from the I'm totally blanking on the DSM-6 or 5, whatever it is. The DSM-5 is that you do not just have a strong rejection of the primary and secondary sex characteristics and gendered characteristics that you currently have, but you also have a strong preference for the other. It is not.
That is true.
Like, that is in the DSM
And
definition.
there's six criteria in the DSM. There's 6 criteria in the DSM. You only need 2 to be diagnosed, and that is not one of them. So you could reasonably be diagnosed with gender dysphoria without ever wanting the secondary sex characteristics of the other sex, because there's 5 other criteria that don't talk about.
Wait.
Sex characteristics.
I didn't say secondary sex. Yes, I'm saying gendered characteristics.
Yeah, so that secondary sex characteristics are gendered characteristics. That would be facial hair, muscle mass, shoulders.
But again, they are, but again, I'm not just saying secondary sex characteristics.
Sure, the DSM also has other aspects like social dysphoria in there as well. Yes, so that would be social dysphoria. So
of the gendered characteristics, yes.
So there's 6 different criteria. You don't need either of those to be diagnosed. So you could reasonably somebody who is diagnosed with gender dysphoria who doesn't want to be treated as the opposite sex or to have the physical characteristics of the other sex.
You do.
No, you don't.
What you're describing, the social
I can read it to you.
Dysphoria that you have is part of the rejection and preference of different gendered characteristics, but you're separating these by talking specifically about primary and secondary sex characteristics, and I'm saying there are a ton of other gendered characteristics that are also included, and when you go through the list of things that they have on there, they are all still falling into gendered characteristics in some way.
So I'm specifying the difference between social dysphoria and gender or sex dysphoria. Gender or sex dysphoria is going to relate to primary and secondary sex characteristics. Social dysphoria is going to denote to the way that you navigate the world, being dressed properly, being able to, use the men's restroom. The six criteria, you only need 2 of the 6 to be diagnosed with gender dysphoria. Out of these, only one of them refers to sex dysphoria. There's another one that denotes specifically social dysphoria. Outside of that, you can be diagnosed with gender dysphoria without having either of these things. And the APA also firmly denotes that you don't have to have gender dysphoria in order to be transgender.
Last time I went over it. Okay, last time I went over it. Well, transgender is a totally different thing. We're talking about whether or not you have gender dysphoria, but they do not choose who is or is not trans. They choose who does. They can give diagnosis. They can't diagnose somebody trans. So I don't care what they say about the word trans. I care what they say about the word gender dysphoria. So what are the other things on there? Because last I read it, I remember.
So one is marked incongruence between one's experience or expressed primary and secondary sex characteristics. 2 is strong desire to be rid of one's primary or secondary sex characteristics. 3 is strong desire for the primary or secondary sex characteristics of the other. 4 is strong desire to be of the other gender. 5 is strong desire to be treated as the other gender. 6 is strong conviction that one has the typical feelings and reactions of the other gender. So out of all of these, you only need 2 of these, and none of them are required. So I could easily say, so reading these criteria, I'm going to give you an example right now. Number 5 is a strong desire to be treated as another gender. I could live in a matriarchal society. I could be like really oppressed as a man. I'm like, oh my God, like the feminists are going to kill me. I really wish that I was a girl so I could fit in with the girls. That's boom, one right there. The second one is a strong conviction that I have typical feelings or reactions of the other gender. I could, get really pissed because I lost Call of Duty and throw my fucking controller through the wall. And my doctor's like, holy shit, you're a man, Malcolm. And boom. I would say, obviously, no psychiatrist or whatever worth their salt, at least in the Western world, would diagnose me appropriately with that. But there is a strong argument to be made that secondary sex characteristics and social dysphoria are not like required in order to be diagnosed with gender dysphoria.
I agree. I think there's some sort of confusion in what it is that I'm saying. Everything that you just said proved again, like what it is that I'm trying to argue here is that all of those have to do with dysphoria over gendered characteristics. Not specifically primary or secondary. I'm talking specifically gendered characteristics. It all has to do with.
I would recommend using the word trait instead of characteristics, because when you're saying characteristics, you're invoking like a state of being. Okay, so if you're saying like either behaviorally, do you think that a boy who likes to play with Barbies that would be sufficient for you to meet that criteria? Like, if you see a little boy playing with Barbies, you're not like, oh, a girl. Like, obviously, there's more like input that goes into your sensory understanding to say like, oh, this is a boy or a girl, right?
Not the trait, not one trait by itself, obviously not. But a lot of traits that are leaning towards something other than what it is that aligns with their sex, yes, of course.
So the question would be, as far as linguistic utility is concerned, how many traits would you need to have?
There isn't an answer to that because that's not how concepts work. We can't say like how many legs does a chair need before it's a chair. It doesn't work that way.
Well, sure, but you're still appealing to like an underlying fact or an underlying principle. So if I was to say like, I can very concretely say like what I would. So if we just walk with me for a second.
Describe it that way.
Just take this little leap with me for a second. If we were to talk about sex instead of gender, I can very concretely describe to you how I would consider somebody who has transitioned fully to like meet the criteria of somebody who's a female, or at the very least not a female. But with gender, I understand that the edges are a little bit more fuzzy. But what I'm trying to say to you is that because there is that fuzzy aspect to it, and because it is like socially motivated and linguistically motivated, one, it's still appealing to an underlying principle. And two, the people that you're like talking about as far as non-binary people are concerned are trying to get off of that. Like they're identifying away from it, and they don't put gendered weight or emphasis on certain appearances, behaviors, tendencies, anything like that, where they would say, oh, you cried at the Notebook. That's not like a girl behavior. Or you like to wear skirts. That's not a girl behavior. That's just something that you personally like to do. That's what the off the spectrum is.
Yes, but that is prescriptive. Again,
that's not prescriptive. That's descriptive.
So just let me to say that something that we would consider feminine and that is socially considered feminine, that you're going to say, I don't consider this feminine. That's cool that you don't consider that feminine. But conceptually, we do. And when we use the word feminine and when we're talking about traits and characteristics, those things fall under the word feminine. We are still describing it that way. So when you get things that we would call gendered characteristics and we would consider them either masculine or feminine, but you're just saying, oh, well, I just don't, that's cool. But that's the point of the doc, is to say, this is what people mean when they say these words. And so you just saying, well, I don't mean that, that is prescriptive now. You are saying, I want to make a world where we don't gender these things. And so I'm choosing not to use the language the way that everybody else does.
So, again, that would be completely subjective, because what I would consider to be like masculine or feminine is going to be vastly different from what you would be considered masculine or feminine. And even on a societal level, these things are going to depend like socially on a billion different factors. Like I grew up Catholic. It was not gay for guys to wear, like the priest robes or whatever. If I, go to Alabama and I step outside wearing basically a dress, I'm going to get my ass fucking whooped for looking like a chick wearing a dress, right? So like I don't disagree. Like I understand what you're saying. Even prescriptively, and I am talking prescriptively, there are still denotions where these characteristics, depending on where you are, or I shouldn't say characteristics, excuse me, these traits, wherever you are, like if you're a girl who likes to play with fucking Tonka trucks instead of Barbie dolls, that isn't necessarily going to be considered masculine depending on where you are. So the separation between those two things is going to be contingent on a bunch of different factors. So it is prescriptive in a sense, yes, but because there is that ambiguity in the way that we describe it, if you have this group of people, of non-binary people, and in the context of all these different organizations that employ the exact same kind of language, the utility of describing them as non-binary is that they are this other thing. They're not just saying like I'm the perfect blend of both. They're a separate thing. That is what I'm trying to communicate. Is that is the prescriptive understanding of what non-binary is.
I agree. That is the prescriptive understanding of what it is.
Oh, I meant descriptive. Please unice me. Please put me down like Old Yeller. I meant to say descriptive. I'm so sorry. Please.
I was like, fuck, I thought we had it on.
I know, fuck, I'm sorry. That was my bad. I'm sorry. I will take the L on that one. I meant descriptively. Excuse me. I'm sorry. Mashallah. Okay. I apologize.
So I disagree that a chair has an underlying fact of the matter. I disagree with this. So there's like in the doc, I talk about like shapes and forms and the fact that we can see something often enough to where there is some sort of pattern recognition there that we see, and we just know we categorize it in this way. Artistically, somebody could go get like a water fountain and say, I'm calling this a chair. And it's like, oh, for the sake of art, now we're calling this a chair. That's really cool. And now we all just call it a chair because for the sake of art, for pragmatically, we're going to do this. But when it comes to the real world, what we call chairs, we all kind of collectively agree on just based on the thing that we can see and based on the utility of it, we know you can sit in it. Now, does that mean that if I kind of like take this chair that one person can generally sit in, and I kind of like start to like stretch it out a little bit more and a little bit more, like, well, eventually it's going to get to a point where we call it like a couch or a bench or something like that. But we have spots in between where we call it like a love seat or, something like that. We also have like, stools and like a bunch of other things that are similar to chairs and somewhere close, but also not the same as chairs. And that doesn't change the fact that we still know what a chair is and that we can all look at something and know that we call it a chair. That like the blurry lines don't defeat the entire concept itself.
I don't disagree with you. What I'm trying to argue specifically is there is I think this is where we are hinging. This is where the hinge is. This is where we're falling on different sides of the spectrum. When you're talking about the linguistic application, you're talking about how people are perceived, yes?
Kind of. I'm talking about how we use the words, and then I'm saying that we use the words to talk about how people are perceived and how we identify with them.
Yeah, so you perceive them a certain way, so you use this word to describe what you're seeing, basically.
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Or again, or your identity, but yeah.
Yeah, so the hinge is when I'm talking about the linguistics of using the word non-binary, it has a very specific meaning, which denotes to somebody that it wants to be separated from the binary itself, not to fall into the middle of it. That's what that word means. And so when I'm talking about it, I'm not, like, the idea that you could look at someone and say that person is non-binary, I think is asinine. Like, obviously you have freaks of nature that walk around, with, like, purple mullets and shit like that, and you can probably safely assume that's a they, them. You can probably safely assume that. However, when we're talking about like non-binary itself, that describes like more of an identity rather than like something that you can observe and label in a sense where I can look at somebody and say that is a woman or that is a man. Does that make sense? I think that's where our hinge is missing.
Kind of. So if Hulk Hogan does say that they are a woman, and you're saying, well, there's some sort of fact of the matter, like what is it? In this case, if they haven't transitioned at all, if they haven't like, they're not taking hormones. They don't plan on doing any of these things, but they are telling us that they're a woman. Obviously, they're communicating something, but it doesn't seem to be relevant to what it is we're using those words for. So
I would
what is the
say
fact of the
I would say that the
matter
fact of the matter is like an internal sense of identity. And I will caveat by saying that I think that there are ways to determine if somebody is acting in good faith in the way that they personally identify. Because the next reasonable question that somebody will ask is like, why would you believe Hulk Hogan but not Steven Crowder? And I think that you can look at certain people's types of behavior and the way that they engage with certain subject matter. Obviously, it's like a big thing where like if I knew somebody who was in the closet, who was trans, who like couldn't go on hormones because they had like a heart condition or something, like I would be like, okay, yeah, like I'll call you a dude, whatever. Like it's not that big of a deal. But obviously, if somebody's doing it in like a joke, and there's a big gray area in there, but it's going to come down essentially to like good faith identification and then like intent to want to change. And I think that comes to like a fundamental understanding of identity. Like even if you can't physically, you have the intent to do it at the very least. And obviously that's flawed in a sense because it is self-report. But in the same way that if a patient goes to a doctor and reports that they're feeling depressed, we are going to take that on face value 9 times out of 10. We don't throw people in MRIs to see if they're depressed, right? Does that make sense?
Yes,
Okay.
and I agree, and that's how I describe it in the doc as well. As I say, look, if I go into somebody's house and they say, oh, I'm a huge Falcons fan, love the Falcons, huge Falcons fan, my favorite team. But then I walk into their house and they have a bunch of Tom Brady posters and Patriots posters and Falcons suck posters and shit like that. I'm gonna be like, bro, you're not a Falcons fan. What are you talking about? But they can feel like they're a Falcons fan and they can use the word to say, I'm a Falcons fan. But when they say it, they are not communicating what it is that the rest of us are when we say Falcons fan. So even though there might be some identity there that actually like feels like they want to be called Falcons fan, it is the word that they have an identity with,
I completely
not
agree with
the
you.
actual
I
team itself
the separation
or
that
the
I'm
fan.
having here, because I agree completely with you, the separation that I'm having here is that so like I'm appealing to like the objective fact here is going to be that underlying sense of identity that requires like intent to change and then obviously like good faith communication of what it is. So if we take that to be true, that there is this underlying fact of the matter about identity, I would extend that past that and I would say that if somebody identifies as non-binary, obviously there's not like a measurable way to determine if somebody is non-binary. Like you could, if you want to take like the super like aggressive route, you could say that there is a way to like observe if somebody is actually binary trans or not, because it's like, did you get surgery? Are you going on hormones? You know, did you socially transition? Did you medically transition? There's a way to do that. But if we're looking at it from the perspective of like a non-binary person, even if they do medically transition, how do you in good faith know that somebody is identifying as non-binary? There's this underlying identity if they aren't striving for androgyny.
That would be it. Is it like that? Yes, that they are striving for androgyny. That would be the way that I would, because yes, if they look like Marilyn Monroe, I'm probably gonna think, I don't think that you're non-binary. And when I say in those DMs that like there is this like pattern that I see where people just call themselves non-binary, and this is starting to become an issue. It's not just the xenogenders, and it's not just all of those things, but it is like a lot of women specifically who seem to have like an identity crisis and want something like that they can latch on to, something that they can like that something that can be interesting about them, and then they just identify as non-binary as something that they can now have, because non-binary can be anything, it can be whatever, even though they very obviously fit a stereotypical gendered person.
So I would disagree with that because one, again, like the colloquial usage of the word non-binary, what the word actually means, and then its application as well, is gonna just drive home again that it's not about androgyny, it's about separating yourself from that binary. The second thing that I would argue is that just because people don't behave or are perceived in a certain way doesn't take away from the underlying fact of the matter. Like I said earlier about like if we're using the comparison to race, if you have like a white guy that grows up in like the hood and you know he grows up and he only knows black people, he's never been around black people or white people before. Think about like Steve Martin the Jerk, if you've ever seen that movie. Like what do we do with that person if this we're looking at their behavior in their environment and the way that they move in that environment? That doesn't really determine what they are, because there's still an underlying fact of the matter that in the Jerk, Steve Martin is white, right? So how do you separate those
Yeah,
two
it
things?
depends on what it is we're categorizing. Well, in this case, when it comes to gendered characteristics and traits, part of like what it is how you act, your like body language, the way that you dress, secondary sex characteristics. Like there are a lot of things that play into that, and it eventually like forms this full pictured thing. So when I draw the spectrum, I put on there just to kind of like help people understand like where we are on the spectrum. I do put on there like flamboyant gay man,
Yeah. And I
towards the
think
middle, and butch lesbian
we're
closer
hinging
towards
again.
the middle.
We're hitting that hinge again, where the linguistic application of the word is to invoke identity, is not to invoke a concept in your mind. It's to identify with something. Because if I say I'm a man, that invokes a concept. The point of non-binary is to be off of that. So if I say close your eyes, Tom, picture a non-binary person, you might do like the stereotypical like transgender because thank you TikTok. But the point of that is to separate from that, to not invoke that thing, to be like its own category away from everything else. Like that is the point of it, is what I'm trying to explain.
Understand. When I'm describing this, the reason that I'm describing this is to say that the concepts are there, right? The concepts already exist, and we have the forms or whatever it is that you want to call it that give us the ideas of a feminine person and a masculine person, and we can identify those and categorize them fairly easily, like 99% of the time. And then when we can't, generally, yes, they are normally fairly androgynous. But once we start saying, oh, it's off the spectrum, okay, that's fine. Just as like cuttlefish and those things exist, and those are identities, and they are all like valid and fine in and of themselves. I just wouldn't call them gender. Now, as soon as they are off the spectrum, now if they're not part of the concept and they're not part of the spectrum, then they're just not part of gender anymore. Now they are a separate thing.
Well, and that's usually the goal, is kind of the point. And it's the same way that like when the way that like intersex was kind of forced to be like this midpoint between sexes, but in reality, the way that a lot of people would describe it is that it is, for at least in this sphere that I'm in the transgender sphere, is like people who are intersex usually separate themselves from that, where they're like, I'm this other thing that's over here. Like, I don't know what the fuck everybody else is doing, but that is like the point of it, essentially. Mm-hmm. And something that something that I find very interesting is that like this has been, a big question, at least in like lesbian spaces for a long time, for very butch lesbians. So I found it interesting that you put it on your gender spectrum, because there are a lot of, lesbians that will write quite extensively about the idea of like their relationship to gender being so fucking different, because even though they are women, they present so masculinely, and they have like an affinity towards womanhood, but they fit into this weird position where it's like they are not perceived as or treated as women because of the way that they behave or the way that they act. So I think, again, like the whole purpose of it is to invoke that separation. And you can say like, oh, this is not gender, but like if we're thinking about, your race, sex, height, gender, whatever the fuck, like what you have to put something there. So what are you going to put? It's like, I don't know. I don't really vibe with any of this shit. So I'm just going to say non-binary, which means like something else entirely. Like it's just the way that it's constructed, the way that people communicate with it. I don't think that it is essentially like this weird, like middle ground androgyny. That's not the way that the word is used, and it's not what it means. So like what you're saying that you're trying to avoid with the idea of non-binary not being a gender, that's like specifically what non-binary is trying to do, is get away from that constructed paradigm.
Okay. So when we're talking about there is something there that is being communicated. To me, the concepts exist first. The categories exist first. Then we identify with them. The Falcons exist first, then I identify with the Falcons, right? If somebody is identifying with something off the spectrum, again, that's fine. There are tons of identities that are not gender, tons of them. Like most identities are not gender, but that doesn't mean that gender ceases to exist.
Nobody says that. Well, no, because gender, the way that you perceive gender does, gender only exists as far as we offer it utility. So if you have a group of people that offer no utility to that category, it no longer has meaning to them. In the same way, if I go to a different country where they do possess that idea of like a third gender, that is what the purpose of it is to separate from these things.
I understand, but that's my point, is that here we do identify gender as like,
and that's why people are pushing for it.
Different things.
That's why people are pushing for it. They're trying to change the way that it's used.
Exactly.
Let's go, they fabs. Let's go, they fabs.
That's exactly why I say it is 100% prescriptive. It is not descriptive. And so when I'm talking about a descriptive thing about gender, this is how I'm going to explain it. If we want to get prescriptive, then yes, now we're going to be talking about like, gender abolition and all of these other things.
Well, sure.
But
I don't disagree with you. That was kind of my criticism as a whole. And obviously, again, I say this, and please, I'm my voice and my tone are generally pretty snarky. That's my fucking X chromosome, my Y chromosome. My X chromosome talking, whatever one it is. So I'm not trying to be bitchy or snarky or anything. But when I read your document and I understand what you're doing with your document, it reads to me as like very remedial. And I don't mean that in like an offensive way. I mean that as somebody who has like been in like the gender discourse for like fucking ever, unfortunately, because like when you're trans, there's like a gun to your head and you have to talk about the shit all the fucking time with other trans people. Otherwise, they'll cancel you on Twitter. Is like when we take a step beyond that and we start looking at it in a more esoteric application and what people who identify as non-binary are trying to do with that identity, that like it does expand beyond like the normal, like I look at somebody, I see big tits, fat ass, red dress, blonde hair, woman. It goes beyond that, right? And it goes beyond like somebody who I'm like, I don't know if that's like a twink or if that's a lesbian. I have no idea. So I'm going to say other. Like it goes beyond that. So I understand what you're doing with your doc. That was my criticism, if that makes sense.
The last time it was, but that's what we talked about last time, is that I said, if I ever go back and change it, the first thing I'm doing is changing, like taking non-binary out of there completely.
Tom, it's a Google Doc. You can do that right now.
I don't believe non-binary has anything to do with gender, and that like I change all of that to androgynous. But like, yes, I just don't think when we say, oh, well, what gender are you? And somebody says non-binary, I would just have to ask them the question again then.
You would just, so what you would ask them is what sex they were assigned at birth, because that's what you're looking for. Because the way that they are identifying is saying like, oh, I don't want to relate to masculinity or femininity on the spectrum at all. What you want to know is, do you have a dick or a pussy? And you shouldn't ask it that way. You shouldn't ask it that way. You should say, what was your sex assigned at birth? Because that's essentially what you're invoking. Are you girl non-binary or are you boy non-binary? Yes, that's what that is. Are you girl non-binary or boy non-binary? Yes, that's what that is.
Nothing I said had anything to do with sex whatsoever. Like,
it 100% does if you're asking, are you girl non-binary or boy non-binary? Do you get the boy toy at McDonald's or the girl toy at McDonald's? That's what you're asking. That's 100% what you're asking.
Where are you getting that? What question do you think is asking that? I'm not asking that at all.
When somebody says, I'm non-binary, and you say, that doesn't mean anything to me, I want to know what gender you are you man or woman? That's what you're asking them. You're asking, are you the boy non-binary or the girl non-binary?
No, again, I'm talking about gender. You understand.
Boy and girl, are those sexes or are those genders?
Those are genders.
Yeah, so you say, are you the boy non-binary or the girl non-binary? That's what you want to ask. Because you don't believe the concept of being off of that. So that's what you want to ask them.
But you said right before that, as though those are the same things. What were you born as?
Yeah, what was your assigned sex? Because that is usually correlated to people who don't transition. So if I'm assigned female at birth, I don't medically transition, I identify as non-binary, you're going to look at me and you're going to say, your gender is woman. So you're woman non-binary. They're like literally on top of each other.
Yes, again, that's not related though. Like when at the beginning of the doc, I like explained, like, I'm not talking about trans people. I'm using trans people somewhere in this to like talk about like where we draw lines and things like that. But this doc is not about trans people. It's about gender, and that like how gender is this completely separate concept from sex that just has like a correlation with it and aligns with it for reasons, but that it is not sex. And so I am talking about gender, and I don't care what they were born as or anything. If I'm asking about their gender, it doesn't mean anything to me.
Well, then you're just using gender the wrong way then, because that's what it's a proxy for. I thought that you were a linguist, Tom. Come on, man.
I understand that it happens to be a proxy.
That is the prescriptive understanding of what gender functions as, is a proxy for sex.
Are you saying descriptive this time or prescriptive?
Did I say prescriptive again?
You did.
You should just kill me. Just do it.
So I agree that gender ends up being a signifier for sex, but if we're going to talk about gender as a separate thing, I am separating it in that doc to say this just is what it is, separate from sex. Now I go into it to say I don't think it can ever be abolished, because I do think that there are things that align with sex that will just make us masculine or feminine, and that we will always have these because males and females are different in some ways that will still be categorized as different, and it won't be sex, it will be characteristics and traits. And so we will still have these separate things that will always be there, and we will always recognize the patterns, and therefore we will always categorize them as separate, and that just will always exist, but it is still a separate thing that is not sex.
Well, Tom, unfortunately, my time is coming to an end. My wife is getting crabby. I will say, what does it say in here? As a professional linguist, Tom, you should have been more clear that you weren't talking about trans people. You shouldn't have included trans people at all. And also, like, that still...
It said in there that I'm using them as like a way to like draw lines and stuff and describe the concept better, because obviously using edges and like hypotheticals and things like that, that's how we like show people where we're drawing lines on things.
Do you find it concerning that as a superstar professional linguist, you have this issue where you are constantly being misunderstood? Is that not like a look in the mirror moment and see the Malcolm looking back at you on the other side?
Misunderstood.
Oh, I mean, I guess that's a subjective judgment, but I don't know. I'm just like, I have to reiterate over and over again that I'm not talking about trans people. I mean, I feel like a linguistic superstar would just not have that issue because it would be communicated clearly.
I think that people automatically, when they think of the word gender, because it's been separated from sex,
or because you use gender and transgender people in your document, that could also be part of it, without clearly, explicitly stating that this is like a metric or a bandwidth to test this idea. But nonetheless, I apologize that I am an old man and I have to go. But we only got through like one of the things I wanted to talk about. If I didn't make you too horribly angry, I would be happy to chat again when I have more free time. I apologize again for having to put this off for so long. I just had a thing come up this weekend where I was out of town. But I love talking to my egg-headed brother here. This is great. We're like Humpty Dumpty. You're Humpty and I'm Dumpty. This is like quite the pairing.
Fair enough. All right, yeah, just hit me up. I'm down whenever.
Before I go, what kind of vape are you smoking?
Everything's worn off of it, so I have no idea.
What flavor is it?
Mango.
That is the most womanly bitch shit I've ever heard in my entire life. You should smoke a cigarette like a real man, Tom. I'm the man here.
I'm defying gendered prescriptions right now.
Welcome to the club, sister. Happy Pride Month. All right, Matt, I'll talk to you later, okay?
All right, later.
Okay, let's listen to Tom's chat. Let's listen to his stream. Is he talking shit? As a superstar professional linguist. Yes, hang on, let's refresh. Let's see, where are we? Yes. Okay, we have to go back a couple of seconds, hang on. Oh, hang on, I gotta go back a little bit more. Fuck. Let's see. Fuck. Hello? Hang on. Okay, here we go. Talk to you later, okay?
All right, later. All right. I know he's fucking around, but it is like, one, pretty sure I do state pretty clearly in there that I'm not that doc is not about trans people.
Well, let's see, guys. Let's see.
Is about gender.
Where's
I'm pretty sure I state that very clearly in the doc. I'll check in just a second.
Yeah, let's check.
I want to make sure because
let's check. Let's check, Tom.
So
let's do it.
Positive.
Yeah, let's check. Yes, Tom. Yes.
Totally mistaken.
We only get a few more minutes of bro time, you guys. How is everybody feeling? Is everybody having a good time?
It is this thing online where people keep saying, don't you think it's weird that as somebody who says that they worked in linguistics that you're being misunderstood so often? I'm like, I'm on the fucking internet, dude. No, not at all. Not whatsoever. If you want to go talk to all the people who actually got degrees that I was friends with in this space that streamed as well. They all hate the fucking internet because everybody misunderstands every other fucking word out of their mouths. Yet, when you go.
Wow,
like,
there's
when I'm out in the
non-binary
real
right here.
world-
Why would you
No, I don't
use
have
this
a decision.
example if you didn't want
I don't
non-binary
have a
people in here?
decision. But
Why would you have this in here if you didn't want to talk about like non-binary people? That doesn't make any sense. Transition. So if one's outer gender expression doesn't, they should transition. Okay. Okay. What else do we have in here, guys? Gender is both biological and sociologically constructed, or socially constructed. Detransitioners, transition, dysphoria, transitioning. Feminine and masculine areas in the spectrum. But anyone who isn't gender fluid will inhabit a small part. Overlap between sex and gender. This person fits the concept of woman doesn't mean the word woman is never used to communicate. And then we get a Mike Wazowski. Hit him with Mike Wazowski. Sex assigned at birth. Playing with gendered toys. Like, here we have sex differences in the brain, which is totally debunked. We didn't get to that, by the way. Gender Trouble by Judith Butler. Or The Second Sex by Simone de Beauvoir. Like, I would find... Let me turn my camera back on. I think that you would be hard fucking pressed to find anybody who is talking about gender in any kind of capacity, and they're able to do this, like, completely void of, like, trans people. Like, there's no fucking shot. There's just no fucking shot, dude. Anyway, that was cringe and gay. Cringe and gay! Cringe and gay!